Alright, so in this video we'll be talking about the microscopic structure of bones, and then a little bit about those 4 bone cell types that we discussed in the introduction. So let's get started here. Okay, so as we look at the microscopic structure of a bone, and I'm hoping that you're remembering stuff from when we did our chapter 5, because we talked about osteocytes then as being the most, as being the primary cell type that we find in bone. And if you recall, those osteocytes lived in little walled off, or surrounded in the bone in those lacunae, and that they had extensions off of their cell bodies that could reach out and connect with other osteocytes, each isolated in their own lacunae as well. So these extensions are used to transport nutrients, gases, and wastes, and so they can collect from the blood, and then say oxygen or glucose from the blood, because it passes from cell to cell through these extensions that are found in little canals that are referred to as canaliculi. So osteocytes are the bone cell. They're found in their own little chambers called lacunae, and the chambers are connected together by canaliculi, and the osteocytes have extensions off their body that they use to share nutrients and wastes and gases with other osteocytes so that they can get material out of the blood to them wherever they are isolated in the bone, and then get their waste products delivered back to the blood. And so when you look at a bone, it is composed of 2 basic kinds of bone types. There's compact bone, which is what we observed in our tissues lab, and then another kind of bone that's referred to as spongy bone. So, and each bone is made up of different amounts of each of these kinds of bone. So depending on what the need and the purpose of the bone is, then you'll find either more compact bone in it or more spongy bone. So let's talk a little bit about those 2 different bone types. The first one we're going to start with is compact bone. And in compact bone, the bone matrix is very dense. So all of those calcium and phosphorus salts are packed closely, tightly together, and the bone surface is smooth. When you slice it, it is smooth and fairly homogeneous. About 80% of the skeleton is composed of compact bone, and all of the outer surfaces of any bone is lined, it's covered in compact bone. So this is the covering bone, and it makes up a good proportion, especially where we need very, very strong bone. And so when we think about the functional units of compact bone, that's where we start talking about the structure called the osteon. And when you looked at bone underneath the microscope and you saw those concentric rings, so the rings inside rings with more rings on the outside, and then the osteocytes here at the where those rings meet in their lacunae, what you were looking at is the cross-section of a single osteon. So this is that cross-section. So we've lifted this one osteon up away from all of its partners. This is the outer surface of whatever the bone is. And here we are at the medullary cavity, so at the central portion of the bone. We know that we have not talked yet about what those regions are, but we'll get there. And so this is an osteon, and each osteon, here's another osteon, here's another, sorry about that, here's another osteon. Each one of the osteons has at its very core an empty cavity called the central canal. And it's inside of this central canal that the blood vessels run. And also in there, so not only do we have a capillary or an arterial and a venule, but we also have lymphatic vessels that are collecting any excess fluid, and also nerve fibers. So that's what the yellow part is here, that's running through this, from central canal to central canal. So the bone matrix is laid down in layers around the central canal, and so that's what we're seeing here. And each of the layers that wraps around it, or you can think of it, this material here that is in between each one of the ring lines. So here's another layer of that. If there was, I did a bad job with my drawing here, but hopefully you get the idea. Here's another layer. So I'm making every other layer solid. So each one of those layers of bone material are referred to as lamella. And so if you have several lamella, then you have lamellae. So that E is the pluralization. So these are the concentric layers of bony matrix that surround the central canal. And it's at the intersection of one layer and the next that we find the lacunae with the osteocyte living inside. And then the central canals can be connected to each other by transverse perforating canals. So this is the perforating canal here, and it connects the central canal of this osteon to the central canal of this osteon. So we have blood vessels that connect between them. So that's how we're able to bring the blood into the bone matrix, so that we can do the exchange between these are the cells that are in their lacunae. So there's direct exchange here, and then indirect exchange that helps to get materials all the way transported up, in, and through all of the different osteocytes in their lacunae. So in long bone, we see an outer covering of compact bone, and then here at the shaft of the bone is where there's a hole where these tall columns of here we have the tall columns of the osteons, and they give a lot of strength to the bone. So when I jump up and down, or if I were to grab or lift or hoist something over my head, this is the humerus here. So this shaft region of the bone is very, very strong, especially in compression. Now, if on the other hand, in a karate class, somebody gave me a big chop in this direction, so a lateral force, then that could potentially break that bone. It would be very unlikely to break the bone just because I jump up and down if I have normal, good, healthy bones. So compact bone, because of these columns, they create very, very strong structures in the body. Okay, so there's compact bone. Now let's look at the microscopic structure of spongy bone. And spongy bone can also be, can also be referred to as cancellous bone. So spongy bone or cancellous bone, it's the same thing. And this is an electron micrograph picture showing what are called the trabeculae. So trabeculae are the branching bony plates that make up spongy bone. And I'll have in lab a piece of bone that we gave to our dog, and then once the dog was finished with it, I cleaned it all up, and you'll be able to see really clearly what this spongy bone looks like. But because all of this material here, that's making up the branches of the trabeculae, so here are trabeculae plates and branching bits of bone, because it's all built of bone, it's not spongy and soft, it's just got all of these open spaces. And it's very valuable because it helps to lighten up the skeleton. So that's one value of spongy bone. And we find spongy bone frequently in, say, the ends of long bones. So if this is the end of a long bone, and if it were filled with all these branching plate-like trabeculae, well, I can squeeze on the bone here and here, and the bone can resist the force because I've got fibers that are running in approximately this direction all throughout. Not fibers, but bone material that's running, in this direction to help resist any crushing kinds of forces. And if I squeeze it right here, well, look, there's also trabeculae, these bone plates that run in the direction that would resist that squeeze. And if I squeeze it here, well, we've got trabeculae that are going to help with that. To resist that force, and the same if we squeeze it from this direction, and well, I got these trabeculae that are all running this way. So what spongy bone allows is that the bone end can resist compression or resist the forces of compression when they are applied in many different directions at once. And that is a situation, say, that we see associated with the hip bone. So if this is I'm not very good at drawing hip bones, but you get the idea. Here's the greater trochanter and the neck, and here's the articulating surface of the hip. Well, this head is all filled with spongy bone. So where it articulates then with the big hip bone, it is it's got, when we do forces in this direction or this direction, it's got trabeculae that help to resist being crushed from all those directions. So we find cancellous bone or spongy bone at the ends of the long bones, inside flat and irregular and short bones as well. So it's inside a lot of bone. The hip bone is filled with spongy bone, so is the sternum, so are the scapulae. Okay, so let's talk about then the parts of a bone. And so here's the head of a femur. So let's see if I can draw a femur. So here's where the neck's in, and then here's the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter, and then down. It would go on and on until it gets down here to the knee joint. And here are the condyles of the distal femur. So there are two ends to long bones, and this naming system that we're about to discover or to explore is really about how we describe locations on long bones. The two ends are referred to as the epiphyses, so that's how we say this word. It's epiphysis, or if we're talking about two ends, epiphyses. So they're the enlarged ends, and they're filled primarily with spongy bone. So here we can see the epiphysis. There's one end of the humerus is what we're seeing here. So this is the spongy bone that's found inside the epiphysis of the humerus. And so there is a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis, one at each end. And inside, or the end of the epiphyses, are covered by what's referred to as articular cartilage. So remember, that word articular means joints. So it's a coating of hyaline cartilage that's there. It can absorb stresses, and because it's so glassy smooth, which is a characteristic of hyaline cartilage, it helps to reduce friction as the joint moves. Okay, so there are the epiphyses of a long bone. So here's one epiphysis, here's the other, again the humerus, here's the proximal epiphysis up at the shoulder, the distal epiphysis at the elbow. Here's the fibula, again proximal and distal fibula. So the central portion, the area between the two epiphyses, is referred to as the diaphysis. So it's the shaft of the bone, and it's composed primarily of strong and dense compact bone. And the osteons in the compact bone of the humerus are all running this way. So they're like a long, continuous channel surrounded by those densely packed lamellae that really reinforce and strengthen this part of the bone. interior of the diaphysis is hollow, and that hollow is referred to as the medullary cavity. We also talk about it as the marrow cavity because it's filled with yellow marrow. But again, medullary cavity is the primary word that we use to describe this. So epiphyses, and then here we have the diaphysis. Ooh, and I just noticed those labels. Those are bad. Not superior and inferior, of course, but proximal and distal. Okay, so now we're still looking at features that are common to both long bones, but now we can think of these next features as being common to other bone types as well. So all bones are covered on the exterior surface with a tough fibrous connective tissue covering that is called the periosteum. Peri meaning around, osteum talking about bone, and the fibers of this periosteal layer are deeply interwoven with the fibers of the bone. So remember, protein fibers are found inside the bone. So the periosteum fibers intermesh with those bone fibers, and they also intermesh with, let's say we had a tendon connecting here. That tendon would also have fibers that reach into the periosteum. So it's almost difficult to see where the periosteum ends and where this tendon would begin. And the periosteum is there surrounding the bone, covers it, and provides a good strong connection for any ligaments and tendons that need to connect to the bone. It also provides a route for blood vessels and nerves to get to the bone before it branches, so that it enters the bone and then branches out. The endosteum is another connective tissue layer. This time we see it on the interior of the bone. So the endosteal layer would be right here, lining the medullary cavity. Or, and this is a picture of endosteum as well, but this time it's a slice through spongy bone. So here are the spaces between the trabeculae. This is bony trabeculae here. And then there's a lining of endosteum around each of the trabecula, forming like a covering over the trabeculum. And in this layer of connective tissue, there are bone-forming cells that are going to be responsible for bone growth, for bone repair, and the remodeling function of the bone, rebuilding bone to make it even stronger and more cohesive and useful. Okay, so I also promised that we'd talk about the 4 bone cells types. There are osteogenic cells. These are the progenitor cells. They're like not quite stem cells because they can't become anything, but they have a much reduced set of cells that they can form. But when they divide, they're going to produce the osteoblasts. So they're found in the periosteum. They're also found in the endosteum. And any blood vessels are going to be associated with these osteogenic cells. So they grab nutrients from the blood and use those nutrients to help power all of their cell processes so that they can reproduce. They are the only bone cell that's capable of reproduction. And following reproduction, one cell remains a progenitor cell and the other cell becomes the osteoblast. Osteoblast, this term blast, you should associate it with build or make. So blasts build. These are the bone-forming cells. They produce new bone matrix. So osteoblasts build new bone matrix. And when they increase their activity, well, they're going to pull calcium from the blood to build that new bone. So increased osteoblast activity will decrease the amount of calcium available in the blood because they're sucking calcium out of the blood in order to build the bony material. Osteocytes, these are the cells that have walled themselves, when an osteoblast walls itself up into its lacuna, then it becomes a mature bone cell that we talk about as an osteocyte. So osteocytes develop from the osteoblasts and are completely surrounded by the bone matrix inside, and they're inside a lacuna. These are the most numerous cells in any bone, and their job is to maintain that bony matrix around themselves. So they are constantly adding to and repairing any cracks that might be appearing in that bone matrix, producing the proteins that are going to strengthen the bone as well. The last kind of cell is the osteoclasts, and these are the bone-destroying cells. So when you see clasts, think bone-destroying. To help you remember, I always think that clasts will clash with the bony matrix. They'll break it down. They fight with it, break it down. And they do this because they can secrete acid, and the acid helps to dissolve the salts, the calcium phosphate salts and the calcium carbonate salts. And they also produce enzymes that help to catalyze reactions that will break down the fibers that are in the bone. So we get these enzymes that are going to do their job of breaking things down. Here are some osteoclasts. Here's one, here's another, and here's a third. So what I want you to notice about them is, look, they have multiple nuclei. So osteoclasts, rather than being bone cells, are actually blood cells. They're blood cells that are multinucleate, and they form when multiple white blood cells fuse together. And if the activity of osteoblasts and even osteocytes, if they're busy pulling calcium from the blood, well, the osteoclasts, when they increase their activity, they're breaking apart all that bony matrix. What do you think is going to happen to calcium? Well, as they liberate calcium back into the blood, it's going to increase those blood calcium levels. So there you have it. We've talked about the two kinds of bone, the two ways that bone can be built in the body, as either spongy bone, which is not as strong as compact bone, but is equally strong no matter what direction the forces are applied. So we have spongy bone, and we also have compact bone, which is very dense, homogeneous bone. It's very, very strong because it's built of those osteons. We talked about the structures of a long bone, the epiphyses, diaphyses, the medullary cavity, and then we discussed the four types of bone cells: the osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. And I'll see you in the next video.